Well, hello and welcome to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. This is our chainsaw area that we've set up this demo in. My name is Dan Gjertson. I am currently the arborist here on staff. A little bit about me: I've worked in private tree care for about a decade now, and I've just switched over to the public sector. So now I'm the arborist on staff here, and I'm excited to start a program here at the Arboretum in tree care focused on arboriculture. So the talk that I have prepared for today is on chainsaw maintenance and mainly sharpening. So the talk is called a sharp tool is a safe tool. So the advantages that you get from sharpening your chainsaw regularly are not only in reduced amount of fatigue on yourself, but the machine, the motor will be working a lot less if your saw is properly sharpened and cleaned. So moving on to, it's always important for safety. Let's talk about safety for a moment. When you're working on equipment or doing tree care in general, always make sure you have proper PPE. So I've got a pair of safety glasses here. There's always stuff kind of flying off of a saw if you're cleaning it or using a file. There's little metal shards that'll pop up and your face is really close. So safety glasses, and then I would recommend a pair of gloves when you're actively sharpening or handling a part of the saw that has the teeth exposed. So yeah, have those handy. All right, so a chainsaw, I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the chain itself. This is a great instructional tool. This would be on the chain, the cutter. So there's a lot of components of the cutter, but mainly you have the tooth here, and then you have this other part called the depth gauge, or some people call it the raker. The raker or depth gauge will regulate how much wood or wood shaving that this tooth is going to be taking off of the tree or off of the piece of the wood that you're cutting. So in this profile, you can see that there's an angle on this top plate, and then also that lines up with this witness mark on the bottom of the tooth. So this angle is generally between 30 and 35 degrees. If it's closer to 35, it's going to be more for conifers or pine trees. And then if you're getting more into hardwoods, you'd be closer to 30. I've always followed this witness mark and have not really had much of an issue with performance of the chainsaw. All right, there's this area in between called the gullet. And then these two holes right here are where rivets go through and then connect this cutter to a driver underneath, as well as the next cutter and the next cutter and so on. So with a chain and the coinciding bar that you're using, you're going to have measurements that you're going to want to pay attention to. And they should be listed on every bar. I'm going to put these on now that I'm going to handle the saw with cutters exposed. So I'm going to hold this up here. And right on the bar, there's 3 numbers that you're going to be looking for when determining what chain you're going to be putting on that respective bar. And that would be the gauge, your pitch, and the number of drive lengths, which also coincides with the length of the bar. So for instance, this is an MS 201, and for gauge, we have 0.050, that's in inches. The pitch is 3/4 inch pico. And then the drive links, the number of drive links are 50. And that's all on that little schematic right there on the bar. If those numbers are gone, the bar is just worn out. Get rid of the bar, buy a new bar. All right, so we've covered the tooth. We've talked about the numbers on the chains or on the bar that coincides with the right chain. And now I'll display some of the sharpening tools that I like to use. You're going to have your round file on a handle. This happens to be a 5/32 file size, which would go on, or which would sharpen a chain that's on this 3/4 inch picot bar. This would be a filing guide. So if you fit the file with the handle into this guide, like so, this guide, as you're sharpening, I'll move back over here, it's going to allow the file to sit in the proper place while you're sharpening the tooth. So that's the purpose of this guide. It rests on the depth gauge in front and then the tooth behind. So it gets that round file in the proper place. So you're not going too deep or you're not too high. One thing that it doesn't allow you to do is see the witness mark on the tooth. So they've put witness marks or angled lines that you can follow on the guide. But you can also just take a round file, put it on a handle, and then sharpen away. But just keep in mind that you're going to have to be paying attention to how far down you're pushing with the file or if you're pulling up. So just pay attention as you're going along, where on the tooth you're sharpening. You don't want to be going down into where the rivets are. All right, so that's the round files. That would be sharpening your tooth. And then in front of the tooth is the depth gauge, which I had mentioned. So that has to be a certain height, as I mentioned earlier, in order to cut wood. The tooth can't be the same height or shorter than the depth gauge, otherwise you're not cutting. So as you take tooth away, it's going to get shorter. In conjunction with that, you're going to have to shorten the depth gauge. So this tool right here is designed to take off the proper amount. And I'll show this closer up in a different setting, but I just wanted to talk over the tools. So you're going to set that depth gauge guide, or the depth gauge guide in front of the tooth that you're trying to sharpen, or you're sharpening the tooth and you're lowering the depth gauge. So you're going to set it in front of the tooth that you're working on and take a flat file right here. And it doesn't take much, you're just riding it over a couple of times and you've taken it down enough. So there are other sharpening tools that have been produced that speed up this process of sharpening and shortening your depth gauge. And it's a 2-in-1 file. It has 2 round files mounted inside, and between is a flat file. So it's designed to be used in both directions on the chainsaw. So you sharpen all the teeth on one side, flip the tool over, and then do the teeth on the other side. They make these for all different pitches. This happens to be 3/8 inch picot. I always write it on there so I know right away. Sharpie works great. So I know that this is going to be my top-handled saw sharpening guide. Next up, 0.325. This would be for chainsaws that have the pitch of 0.325, and the round file size is 3/16. Saw that you would use that filing guide on, for example, would be the 550 XP that Husqvarna makes. Or 261 steel, same, that like middle size saw. And then you move up into the big saws, 3/8 inch pitch. There's a 7/32 round file in this, and that will sharpen your big saws. All right, the last tool or guide I wanted to show everyone here is made by Oregon. Really, really handy. Has a lot of features that would allow you to decipher what bar you have or what size round file, because they all get worn out and you can't read them anymore. For instance, this is a 7/32 file. You can put it through the hole. Realize it's 7/32. You try and go smaller, it doesn't fit through there. For the chainsaw bars, the gauge, you can stick these in to figure out what gauge saw you have. Similarly, there's some really small slots for drive links, so you're not quite sure what chain you have, so you can stick the drive link inside that to figure out what gauge bar it would go on. So this is really handy to have around. And lastly, there's this little booklet that Oregon has put together. Very, very helpful. If you want to deep dive into any part of what type of cutters there are and chain and all the maintenance involved with chainsaws is covered very well in this little booklet. All right, next we'll move over to the sharpening station and we'll talk a little bit more about sharpening a chainsaw. So we've moved over to the sharpening station now. I've put the chainsaw up in the vise. As you notice, I've put the chainsaw upside down. This has a lot of advantages, or just the main advantage is that you can sharpen the chain in both directions without having the power head in your way. I generally like to stand on this side, and I can switch from one side to the other once I've gone all the way around. I also wanted to highlight that having a good light source next to you is really important if you're trying to look at witness marks on the tooth, or just little nicks and blemishes on the tooth, making sure that you're getting that ideal cutting chisel on that leading edge of the tooth. So yeah, having another light source nearby is great for casting a glare, I'll call it, on the tooth surface. So it kind of highlights the top of the tooth and you can see it really easily. What's important to find before you begin sharpening is where you're going to start. You need a reference. We've got, in this particular chain, there's a golden colored link. I'll call it the master link. If you don't have something like that, there may be two teeth on a chain that are in the same direction. That's a great reference point. Or you can just take a Sharpie and just color over top of the tooth that you're going to start on. That's one of my go-tos, unless I have a link like that I can refer to as my starting point. All right, now this 2-in-1 file guide I will show how to use. Starting on my first link, I can see the witness mark on the tooth, so I'll refer to that as I go, but it doesn't take much with this file guide, the 2-in-1, to get enough off the tooth and then the depth gauge at the same time. This type of sharpening that I'm doing on this chainsaw I would refer to as maintenance sharpening. There's not much that maybe it's dulled a little bit, but for the most part I'm just tuning it back up into a very sharp state. So it's not going to take much for each one of these teeth. I've got 2 strokes there. I'm done with that tooth. On to the next one. Just trying to be really consistent with that angle amongst all the teeth. I'm referring to that witness mark as I go. The guide really helps with making sure you're taking enough of that depth gauge away as you go, and I'm not sharpening the tooth too far down with the round file. Couple more and I've made it all the way around on one side. This is not normally what it would be like sharpening a chainsaw if you've hit something. Like, you'll be taking a lot more material off. Your goal in sharpening the tooth is to take it back to a clean edge. So all these teeth are coated with chrome, and if there's a ding, you'll notice that the surface looks different. The front edge of the tooth won't look like the rest of the top of the tooth. So when you're sharpening a chainsaw or a chain, you want to take the material back until you have that clean edge with just one shiny surface on the top. And you'll do that around the chain for all the teeth, and really consistent with that angle, holding the same angle all the way around. All right, I'm going to talk about an example that you might encounter. Say this tooth here, you hit a rock and there's a few teeth in a row that are pretty dinged up. When you're sharpening those teeth, I would advise taking the material back to the clean surface, so you're sharpening that ding out altogether. That results in a few teeth in a row here that are quite a bit shorter than the rest of the chain. So regarding to the rest of the chain, you want to take a little bit more material off those teeth to get everything in roughly the same length or tooth size. It's more important that each one of those teeth has the same angle as far as how your cuts will be, like keeping them straight through the wood and not curving. Yeah, it's more important to have the angles all lining up than the actual length of the tooth. But that being said, you don't want to have really, really short teeth and then really long teeth throughout the rest of the chain. So find that in-between ground where you balance the rest of the teeth out. All right, one other maintenance tool that I didn't show earlier I wanted to mention is this bar dresser. This one's made by Oregon. Ferd makes a bar dresser as well. You can just use a flat file, and a steady hand will work too. When a bar needs to be dressed, the edges of the top here where the chain is riding, right, those will be rolled over and a burr will form. So the way the saw would be operating at that point is it would initiate a cut, the chain is really sharp, goes right into the wood, and then it stops. And that's because the bar is wider than the kerf that the chain is making in the wood. So you need to dress the bar at that point. So this tool has a flat file mounted into it, and it's set at 90 degrees, or the resting surface is 90 to the file. So you're just going to be pulling that along and getting rid of that burr. And just make sure you get the tool situated in its right spot before you start taking metal away. So take it away until the burr is gone. You could come over onto the other side, go the other way, get rid of the burr on the second side. Now, what you've done is created a really sharp, I would almost call knife edge from getting rid of that burr. So you need to, at this point, knock those edges back down. And I'll just adjust the file slightly. And now I'll run it over the top surface a few times. And then you get rid of that really sharp edge and creating a good reference point for that chain to ride on. A good note, once you've done all of this type of maintenance on the bar, you're going to want to clean the groove out, because I've just put a bunch of metal shavings in there, and you don't want the metal shavings getting caught up into the sprocket. So it's good practice once you've done your maintenance to then clean the tool out or clean the component of the chainsaw out. So I would take an air compressor and just blow out the edges. And I'll talk more about that when we go through the cleaning of the chainsaw. All right. I have finished the sharpening that I wanted to do on this saw. I usually wait till after I'm done sharpening to do any type of cleaning of any of the parts, or cleaning up the bar, the air filter, air cleaner. The tools that I find handy in this process, obviously scrunch, you're going to need that to undo the nuts on the cover here. I have this handy. It's the star bit. So as I go through a saw, if I take it apart, I'll just check a lot of the bolts to make sure that they're in place properly. I'll get to this a little bit later when I'm cleaning the bar. This is a Sod Cutter. It works great for cleaning out the groove of a chainsaw bar. And then this is just a big brush that I picked up at a hardware store. It works great for getting the bulk of the material out of the cover or off of an air cleaner. So I'll get into taking the saw apart. I'll take the cover off first. Air cleaner and the carburetor will be underneath this part. Before you take off an air cleaner, if you're going to take it off to clean it, make sure that you choke the carburetor. That'll close it off so that if you are blowing around other parts, you're not going to get debris down in the carburetor. At this point, I could take the air cleaner off if I wanted to. The majority of any kind of filter cleaning that I do will be with this brush, get the bulk of it off. If you do use compressed air, be very careful around these paper filters. You might, if you get too close and your air compressor is putting out too much air at once, you can tone that back a bit, but just be really mindful when you're doing that. You can also use a really mild dish soap in like an ice cream pail and soak these and swish them around, and then just make sure that you air dry them completely until you put them back in. If you do that process, it's nice to have 2 filters for every chainsaw, so you just cycle in the clean one, let the other ones soak. Continuing on with the dismantle. Husqvarna saws, it's very important that you make sure that the chain brake is undone before you take this off. So beforehand, I've cleaned this out for the most part, but if it had been used for a few days out in the field cutting, there would be debris accumulated inside the cover here around the chain brake mechanism that clamps over the clutch. So you're going to want to do your best with an air compressor to clean all that gunk out. And then look for any missing parts. This cover has chain guides, or these runner where the chain runs alongside. It's screwed in, but other caps have them just pressed. So you're going to want to look around for parts that might be missing. Or if the chain catch, for instance, is bent really badly or damaged, you're going to want to replace that component. And then moving to the saw body itself, same thing as the cover. You're going to want to blow off all the accumulated sawdust and bar oil. Maybe we can do a close-up shot later, but there's star bits or bolts with star bits all over on a chainsaw. So I make sure that they're just snugged up. This is on the dogs, the chain catch here. Multiple bolts everywhere, and after you run a saw, the vibration, you know, you're using it all the time, the vibration kind of allows bolts to creep out. So it's just a good idea to, as long as you have it apart, just snug them down. Every once in a while I take this cover off because there's debris that gets caught underneath there, and I'll blow that out. Maybe a couple of times a year I'll do that, but the majority of the cleaning you can do at this point of the saw body. Everything's pretty exposed. Just getting all the debris from accumulating inside the engine here, or around the engine. Spark plug is mounted right on the top there. Similar to taking this cover off and cleaning, I'll check the spark plug once or twice a year. If my saw is having problems, then yes, I would look at it, but you could take it out and take a look and see how worn the connections are, or if any accumulation has happened. You could just replace the spark plug. Really cheap. It's really easy to do. It's good to keep the engine operating optimally. All right. Moving over to the bar now, I mentioned this Sod Cutter tool. It does a great job of fitting in this groove, and you can start by the sprocket at the tip of the bar, fit it in there, and just drag it all the way down, and then you can just flick it out at the end here. After I do this on both sides, I will use compressed air to clean the rest of the groove out. Just make sure that when you're using compressed air with a nozzle on the end, that you're blowing the material out away from the sprocket. You don't want to be allowing material to accumulate underneath that sprocket. And then there's two really smaller holes on each side of the bar where the bar oil comes out of and then feeds into this groove and then lubricates the chain. So that's a very important spot to check and make sure that it's free of debris before you put the saw all back together. Say the bar was mounted on the saw this way when I took it off. It's good practice to flip the bar and then put it back on upside down in this case. And every time you're doing maintenance, flip it back the other way. It's going to double the length of life that you have in this bar. Bars are fairly expensive, so you might as well do the best you can to make it last long for you. Yeah, at this point, I would go ahead and just reverse your process of taking it apart. And then once you've got everything back together, make sure your chain tension is proper. That's important after taking a saw apart and before you get it back out into the field. You want to make sure that everything is fine-tuned before you put it into work. All right, now I'm putting the bar back onto the chainsaw here. And I wanted to point out that chain tension, yes, you want that to be correct, but there's a subtlety to pay attention to when, in regard to the bar and before you tighten this cover on. All right, I've got it seated and right. I'll tighten these nuts part way and just check where my chain tension is at before I really snug it down, because you can make adjustments at this point. So that feels pretty good. But the point I wanted to make now, it's especially important with the bigger saws that you do this. Before you snug those two nuts down, you're going to want to grab the tip of the bar and pull it up towards you before you snug them. And that's because if I were to, there's a little bit of play in here, you can probably see that. If I were to tighten it when it's in this down position, and then you go out to cut a log and you cut from the top, it's just going to push this bar up, and your chain tension might be a little bit off. So this is a really subtle thing, but I've had good luck with holding good chain tension throughout cutting when I make sure that I pull up on the top here and then snug these two nuts down. Proper chain tension. There's a lot of things that I've heard throughout my time as an arborist, but you don't want it too tight and you don't want it too loose. Too tight, you're not going to be able to pull it off of the bar much at all. It's just going to, and it won't move very well. Like I can move this pretty easily. If it's falling off of the bar on the bottom, that's too loose. You're going to have to tighten the chain tension and bring it up to the bottom of the bar. And it's a good thing to pay attention to throughout your cutting when you're out in the field. If you notice the chain tension is too loose, definitely take the time to just tighten it up again, because that could prevent you from dropping the chain or just breaking it all together, and then you're out of luck. You got to get a new chain on, or maybe you have another saw on you, hopefully. So yeah, it's one of those things that I am hyper aware of all the time, what the chain tension is. It's pretty easy to tell if it's too loose. You'll just see the chain kind of dangling off the bottom there. I'll get the air cleaner back on, replace the cover. There we go, our maintenance on this saw is complete. All right. So we're out in the field here. I just felled a dead red pine. And I wanted to wrap up this chainsaw maintenance and sharpening video with an in-field demonstration. Say I were bucking this tree up, or cutting the limbs and then bucking up the wood, and I encountered the ground with my saw. All right, now I have a dull saw and I still have a stump cut to make. That sounds like a very, long and arduous thing to do. So if I happen to have a field sharpening kit with me, I can easily get it done right here with this stump. They make certain companies, I can't tell you the manufacturer of this one, but if you go to a saw shop or a arborist supply store, they're going to have these Stump Vices, they're called. And they're great for if you have a stump. How convenient. Just take your hatchet or a little felling axe here and install it into the top of the stump here. I like to get it really well seated. I don't want the saw to move around when I'm trying to sharpen it. So I've got that into the stump. Now I have this handy vise that, you know, I can install my chainsaw to the vise. I've got 2 hands to sharpen away and touch up the chain that I accidentally buried into the ground or hit a rock with. So yeah, that kind of wraps up this video on chainsaw maintenance and sharpening. I will be available during the recording or when this presentation is given at Shade Tree. So if anyone has any questions during this video, feel free to add into the chat and I'll do my best to answer those questions. Thank you.